everyone, to the second to last of our speaker series, and we're really happy to have Jackie back with us here at IGOV. Jackie has a long history with our program as a graduate, and someone who I've been fortunate enough to do some work with. We traveled up north to Carrier Country and did some work in the community up there. We wrote a paper together on Aboriginal youth voting, and then I was their supervisor for her master's degree from IGOV, kitchen table consultation.
Yes.
Great phraseology and great work, and now she's gone on to do such great things. I know her community's proud, and we're really proud of her too, having gone to Queen's University, not Queen's in Ontario, the real Queen's, the real Queen's College in England and Cambridge University, and so that's quite an accomplishment itself to be doing your degree over there. So without any further ado, I'm going to let Jackie take it over because I know she has a few words to say, and some of us have to leave, so I'm going to let her get right to her work here.
Awesome. Thanks, Ty. Thank you for being here today. I know there's a lot of things you could be doing today, so I appreciate you spending some time here with me. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging that I am a visitor to this territory. I've been visiting this territory for almost 10 years now, and this land has a very special place in my heart and in my development. So I'd really like to recognize the Salish people of this territory and all peoples on Vancouver Island for having me. I love it here, and I really appreciate it, so thank you. Before we begin, though, I just have a quick story to share with you. Like Tyagi mentioned, I'm going to school in England. I go to school at the University of Cambridge, and I'm from Nunavut. And I will admit that going to Cambridge was a whole other experience. I'll talk about it a little bit in my presentation. It wasn't a very easy fit. The University of Cambridge is not an easy place to go to for the first time, and to engage in academic study in that country, well, to say it's intense would be a gross understatement. But and I fought it. I fought being in England for at least the first 2 years. I actively fought it, which was unfortunate because it cost me so much money to go there. But you know, you live and learn on these things. And there is a turning point in my relationship with the university and with England. And that came because of my supervisor. I have a supervisor named Michael Bravo. He lives in England, but he did his own PhD work in Nunavut back in the 80s. And I have a lot of respect for my supervisor. I will admit it took us a long time to figure out our relationship, just because he talks different than I think. So for the first year, I could honestly say that I don't think we really understood what the other was saying. But luckily, like all good supervisor relationships, you just keep on working at it, right? Well, Michael, it was my second year, Michael traveled up to Nunavut. He does his own research, and he traveled up to Baffin Island, which is where I'm from. And he traveled up to Pond Inlet, which is the top north part of Baffin Island. And my parents live in Iqaluit, which, if you know anything about Nunavut, Iqaluit is the capital of Nunavut. Iqaluit is also the gateway community for any travel up to Baffin Island. So if you're going anywhere in Baffin Island, you have to go through Iqaluit. So my supervisor went up to Pond Inlet, and he was doing his own research. And then he sent me an email while he was up there. And he said, "Jackie, do you think your parents would mind if I come and visit them when I go through Iqaluit?" And I thought, oh my goodness, yes, please go visit my parents. Because I think for a while there, my parents always knew I was going off to school somewhere, but you know, England is really far away from Nunavut, so it's almost like they weren't quite sure if they should believe me 100%. So I said, "Yes, Mom. Yes, Michael, go see my mother. Go meet my mother and my father." And he did. And I was very curious about how that meeting would go, right? Because it's your teacher, it's your parents, you never know, right? And it was the next day that I got a very excited phone call from my mother while I was in England. And I've never heard my mother talk this way before. And I'll tell you what she said to me. I think I called her and I said, "Hi, Mom, did Michael come visit you?" And Mom said, "Yes, he did." And then there was a long silence. And then the silence was broken by a single statement that she just kept on making over and over. In fact, she made the statement over and over for the full 7 minutes we were talking. I was like, Mom, this is a really expensive phone call. You don't have to tell me the same thing over and over again. But she was telling me because she was so excited. And this is what she said to me. She said, your teacher brought me a fish. And she repeated that over and over again. Your teacher brought me a fish. I can't believe it. Your teacher brought me a fish. Now, like I said before, I live in Iqaluit. And Iqaluit is the Inuktitut word. I mean, if you translate Iqaluit, it means place of many fish. So you'd almost be surprised that my mother would be so excited about this one fish. But it was it was so much more than that. It was the fact that she never expected that her daughter's teacher from England would come to Iqaluit, come and stay and visit at their house, and that he would gift my mother with a fish. And it was that moment on that my relationship with England and the University of Cambridge fundamentally changed. Because up until then, I didn't think I could trust my supervisor. There's that whole tension, right? Like, oh, well, I'm his informant. I'm kind of the token Inuk student. He's gonna be able to claim oh, look, I work with Inuit students. I really felt like that. And I mean, he didn't do anything to make me feel that way, but those are ideas I had in my head. And that all went away when my supervisor gave my mother a fish. So I say that because I know the importance. I mean, I really, really respect the ritual of gift giving. I know that it can change relationships, if done in a good way, of course. So before I begin, even though it seems like I've talked for a long time already, I just wanted to give a gift to this house. When I was here in Victoria, they were just talking about building this house. And I think by the time I graduated, I don't know if they've started building actually. I graduated in 2007. I first came into this house last year, luckily through the support of the Indigenous governance program. They organized for me to have an office here. So this was my first, that was my first time coming here last year. And everyone who worked here just welcomed me right in. They didn't know who I was. I was just this kid from up north, but they welcomed me in, fed me, took care of me, made sure I didn't get locked out. And I really appreciated that. And so now that I have this second opportunity to come back to this house, again, thanks to the Indigenous governance program for inviting me to come do this. In preparing for this trip, I thought I should bring a gift of thanks. So I've asked Ruth if she wouldn't mind accepting.
Stand with me too.
Oh,
She's
yes.
one of our elders.
Good, thank you. This is a gift from where I come from. You can open it right there and it should be easy. Yeah. Awesome. Yep. I think so. Yes. See, these stories always work out. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here.
I'm not good at holding it.
Oh, yeah. Just keep on rolling. It'll be okay.
Thank you, Jackie.
Awesome. No problem. Appreciate it. Yeah.
It's always good to have you.
Yeah. Good. Well, that's the best part of the show this afternoon, guys, so sorry. Thanks for having me here. Like I've mentioned maybe a couple of times, I'm a doctoral student. I'm in my 5th year, and I will admit I've hit that wall where you think, I'm never going to be done this degree. And I'm hoping that's not the case. I'm really hoping that's not the case. So part of my inspiration for coming over here was actually to have that opportunity to come have a conversation about the work I've been doing. And it's fitting that I would come back to Victoria. This place is really important for my academic development. So I'm going to share with you today what I've been working on. My supervisor told me a long time ago, actually 2 years ago, he said, "Jackie, be careful of how much you do. It's really easy to become overwhelmed." And like always, I always seem to get what he's saying a little too late. I don't know, I just want to be done. I just really want to be done. So part of the presentation I will do today, it's actually rough draft writing I'm doing. I'm still playing with argument, I'm still playing with flow, I'm still playing with placement. So whatever you have to say to me, please tell me. I'm at that point where I'm desperate for feedback, and I'm desperate for direction, because I can't hold on to this any longer. So whatever you have to offer me, I will gladly accept it. We may not agree, but I will gladly accept anything that you may have to say, and I'd really appreciate it. So not to put the burden on you, but if you want me to finish, I'll need your help. So why don't I just get started, and I guess the way it usually goes is I talk for a bit, and then we'll have time for questions and a conversation. Oh, can I just, as we're talking, I'll just have some pictures going up in the background. There's about 50 pictures, and I just have them on continuous looping. So enjoy, like they're beautiful pictures. They're pictures of back home in Nunavut. Okay, so let's just get some basics out of the way. I go to school in England. I go to a place, I'm situated in a place called the Scott Polar Research Institute. I'm situated within the Department of Geography, and my interest is in governance. Is it working okay? Oh, okay. Aha. Awesome. I'm Inuk from Nunavut. I have very, very, very strong views about Inuit homeland. In my completely biased form, I'm happy to state straightforwardly that Inuit homeland is beautiful, not only in terms of aesthetic, not only is it beautiful to look at pictures of landscape from back home, but Nunavut's also beautiful in its contrasts. The various tensions of Inuit homeland can be so overwhelming, conceptually, but also physically. The power of it is just awesome. Having the daily experience of big, strong forces actually really humbles a person, be it the land, weather, animals, or people. When these various forces collide or work in unison, the outcome, whether good or bad, is powerful. Inuit land is bountiful, but it's a bounty that is way different than here in Victoria. Inuit have access to the land. Even though I don't interact directly with the land a whole lot, I can still see it every day. And I know lots of people whose relationship with the land is an everyday relationship. And I see those people who interact with the land every day, I see them every day. So I have access to the land in a way that I appreciate that a lot of Indigenous nations, especially in southern Canada, especially in the highly urbanized areas, they may not have that access. So I recognize and I appreciate that where I come from is a privilege. I'm very lucky to be from Nunavut. I'm very lucky that this is so accessible to me. I know that's not a reality for all Indigenous nations across Turtle Island. Like I said before, I don't travel a lot. I'm a real settlement kid. In terms of Nunavut experience, I'm a real metropolitan type of person. I do get out on the land sometimes, but never on my own. I only go out on the land when I have opportunity, when other people are willing to take me. And it's because of their good graces that I have experience out on the land. And the reason I think people are always willing to take me out on the land when they are able to is that I really know that I know nothing. So I'm really grateful for whatever knowledge and care that they can give me. Because to go out on the land back home requires a lot of care and a lot of work. So I can't just show up. I know people are expending a lot of energy to support me out on the land. So that's pretty awesome. And although there's a lot of beauty in Nunavut, I do need to be honest and state that there's a lot of struggle in Nunavut today. A lot of people are struggling in Nunavut. As the majority of Nunavut's population are Inuit, the majority, but not all, violence is lateral violence in an overwhelming array of expression. There's a lot of substance abuse in Nunavut, from drinking to harder drugs like cocaine. There's a lot of abuse, be it sexual, physical, or emotional. And this abuse goes on. Sometimes it gets reported, sometimes not. While Nunavut does provide services and programs to address these issues, it's grossly underfunded and not wide-ranging enough to be accessible to all segments of our population. Now, I don't want to sound too much like the Globe and Mail or something that would paint a really negative picture constantly about the reality of living in Nunavut, but I don't want to deny it either. I live in Iqaluit, it's the capital of Nunavut. We see those challenges daily. No matter, it's not hard to find. I won't quantify it, but it's not hard to find those challenges. So even there, right there, I'm trying to highlight that kind of tension exists. That's the tension that Inuit are facing. We have this beautiful land and this really recent history of engagement with the land, but we also have these really challenging daily realities. Now, I should just mention too, although I'm from Nunavut, the last 5 years I haven't settled much in the last 5 years. And this is important because this fact of me not being settled and always on the move has played a really strong part in how I conceptualize what Inuit governance is in Nunavut today. So I've done a lot of traveling between places. This has been a unique opportunity and I've been privileged to do so. Over the last 5 years, the longest I've been anywhere is about 6 months. I've gotten into the habit where I leave just as I'm getting comfortable in a place. A lot of ways, this has challenged my ability to really get to know somewhere. But luckily, I've been, in the last 5 years, I've been moving through the same places over and over again. Essentially, Nunavut, Ontario, England, and once in a while in Victoria. So the fact that I'm traveling to the same places over and over again means I do get depth. I do get to know the places well. It just takes me longer. And it's worked out okay. I don't mind it at all. What I really appreciate with all this moving that I'm doing is that I've gotten better at entering new places. And I've gotten better at entering and getting to know it and finding familiarity. And as time goes on, I'm getting better at finding some kind of feeling of being at home, no matter where I am. So there's a lot of other things I could tell you about Nunavut. I don't know how much knowledge everyone has about Nunavut. Actually, if I can just take a break from the script a little bit, would anyone be willing to share with me what they know of Nunavut, other than what I told you? Don't say that my mom likes fish from up island. Is there anything that people know of Nunavut that they'd be willing to share right now? I'm always interested whenever I travel down south to see what other people know about Nunavut. Just because, I know a lot, but I'm from there. But I never really know what other people think or know of Nunavut. So if anyone was willing, just a little something. I hear it's cold. Nice. You would be correct in that assumption. Yes.
I heard that Resolute Bay is like in competition with Churchill, Manitoba
Yes, yes, it is true. And Churchill has always held a longer popular imagination. So I have to admit, I'm kind of on the side of Churchill, but don't tell people back home. But it's true. It's true. Anything else? One last thing about Nunavut. Angela.
You have your own government?
Yes. Yes. In case you don't know this already, Nunavut used to be part of the Northwest Territories. And in the 1970s, Inuit political mobilization started. And Inuit began to mobilize around land claims. And the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement was the focus, the political focus of Inuit was the focus for Inuit for a good 30 years. And that work of political mobilization came into fruition in 1999, April 1st, when the new territory of Nunavut was created. And with the creation of Nunavut came the creation of the government of Nunavut. And that's kind of been, for a lot of Inuit, that's been the highlight of Inuit political development. It's been an interesting experience. It's been interesting because Nunavut just had its 10-year anniversary. I mean, we're well into our teenage years. And the willingness to critically examine and evaluate the experience of Nunavut is starting to come out. Luckily, I came to IGOV, so I had access to a language and a mode of thinking that would allow me to critically engage with that experience, what Nunavut has to offer, and what Nunavut still struggles with. So it's been interesting. It's been really, really interesting. Now, I'll get back to my research question in a moment. I'm just going to give you a little bit more of a background. Actually, no, sorry, I'm going to change that. Maybe it's because of Nunavut. Maybe it's because I grew up alongside Nunavut political mobilization. Maybe it's because of that I've been fascinated by governance for a long time. Specifically, I've been fascinated with Inuit governance. Actually, it would be safe to say that I'm in love with it. I'm in love with Inuit governance. This love has developed over time, inspired in part by Nunavut, but consistently renewed through critical engagement of the experience. My love for Inuit governance has been informed by learning about other governance systems. And the other governance systems include nation-state governance systems and actually different indigeneity systems that I've had the good fortune of learning about while I traveled through down south. And I don't know how much experience or exposure you may have to the new kind of governance debates that involve the North. It's coming through, or it's kind of known as Arctic governance debates. In Canada, it's been expressed through questions about Arctic sovereignty. Maybe you've heard about that, I don't know. But there's a lot of interest in the Arctic. There's huge interest in the Arctic. And actually, it was because of that growing interest in the Arctic that I decided to go and start my PhD program. And it's because of that huge interest in the Arctic that I thought it was really important for me to go to England to learn about Arctic governance debates. So that's what I did. I moved to England in 2008. My first year in England, it was the 800th anniversary of my university. Now that place is a pretty intense place anyway, but when you throw a 800th anniversary, the intensity level reaches new heights. And that, I mean, I think part of that has aided to my first year experience, which was challenging to say the least. And I guess, I mean, because I'm in my 5th year and I'm trying so hard to get this research, trying to get my thesis done, I thought a lot about that first year. I kept on thinking, well, why was it so hard? What was I trying to do? It always seems worse in my mind, so luckily I kept some good notes. But now I realized, as I'm in the process of writing, I realized that my first year in England, I was focused on learning how England and Europe generally talked about the Arctic. I figured if I learned how Europe and England thought about the Arctic, I would learn on what terms international players would develop and support governance in the Arctic. So why don't I tell you, I have a little excerpt of what I learned my first year. The European Union was actively discussing the Arctic, both in terms of climate change and geopolitics. The British shipping industry talked about the Arctic in terms of insurance and the Northwest Passage. I heard a lot about oil, drilling, and China, not necessarily in that order and not always together. I learned about the successes and lessons of the Antarctic Treaty and the hopes to transfer that experience into the Arctic. And for those of you who don't know anything about the Antarctic Treaty, which I have to admit I did not know until I went to England, the Antarctic Treaty is an international agreement between eight countries that are actively involved in the Antarctic. They're actively involved in the Antarctic because the countries are there to do scientific research. And as you all know, there are no people in the Antarctic. But there's an agreement to kind of determine which countries have access to which part of Antarctica. So you can imagine my thrill at learning that there was a whole segment of people and academics that were looking at seeing, well, how can we transfer the successes of the Antarctic into the Arctic? How can we divide up the Arctic for other countries? I kept on, whenever I would hear stuff about it, I'd always be like, you know, people live there, right? And I never really got a response from them. So that was a really fun experience. And when I say fun, I mean fun. I consistently heard voices of politicians, academics, and citizens pledging their commitment to effectively work with local populations. I saw how quickly this commitment was forgotten in the shadows of the shock that followed Canada's former Governor-General, Michelle Jean, when she tried a piece of seal heart in my hometown of Rankin Inlet. Talks of banning Canadian sealskin were pretty constant. Canute the polar bear was still alive and well living in Germany, and after some heated debates on the effects of being constantly in the public gaze, many wondered which zoo could best house Canute the polar bear and hopefully make a father out of him. Inuit governance was exclusively talked about via participation within sanctioned processes of the nation state, namely land claims or intergovernmental councils. And there is a lot of talk about research. And this was the full range of my first year of learning what the Arctic meant to England and to Europe. Northwest Passage, insurance, climate change, Canute the polar bear. That's how the Arctic was imagined. So as I list all these things and I reflect back on that time, no wonder I was so stressed out that first year. There were huge gaps of Northern experience that were blatantly missing from these debates. And I should state now, I spent a lot of time reading a lot of stuff. I did not just read like 4 or 5 things. I ate through hundreds of readings, articles, newspapers, journals, political statements. It was consistent. And this is the kind of Arctic I came up across. So to say the first year of learning took a toll on me would be a gross understatement, but I did learn some things. I appreciate that my first year struggle was largely the result of me following the threads of these arguments too closely, too exclusively. I jumped right into these debates, and I was not prepared for the great speed in which new voices came in to claim this space. I was being intensively exposed to an Arctic that did not reflect the home I have known in Nunavut. And it was so interesting when I think back, I think on to year 2 and year 3, the language about the Arctic in Europe has changed. The vocabulary has matured. But the vocabulary now being used includes expressions like the Arctic is opening, the Arctic is available, the Arctic is changing. And the undertone of these kind of statements is that you better get to the Arctic quick if you want access to what the North has to offer. And I don't know if I've stated this yet, but I'll be explicit in this. When Europe and England are talking about the Arctic, they're talking about the Arctic in terms of resources. So I know that's one of those obvious things, but sometimes it's helpful just to state the obvious. This is why the Arctic is so fascinating. Someone on the street said there's a lot of oil over there. This is what people are looking for. So of course, in understanding all of this, again, no wonder I was so stressed out that first year. No wonder I hated my first year. No wonder every time I still talk about it, I still get a little stressed. But it's okay. It's amazing what distance can do. And it's amazing what your own memory of the North can do. The whole time I was reading about the Arctic this way, I had to get into a pattern of realizing that no, there's a different Arctic they're not talking about. And I kept on replaying certain words in my head just to keep my sanity. I kept on saying words like vibrancy, people, lived experience. I also thought about words like contradictions and challenges. Because if I was going to remember the Arctic, I was going to be honest about the Arctic. I wasn't going to romanticize it to myself. I mean, which I could do, and I did some days. But I wanted to constantly remain rooted in an understanding that yes, the North is complicated. Yes, the reality is challenging. But guess what? I still love it, and I still think it's beautiful, even with all the challenges that are around. And that's how I kept my sanity. I had to work really hard for it. As you can see, I'm such a well-adjusted person today, so. As I was learning all of this, I wasn't alone. Inuit have been actively engaged in international Arctic level debates. And I don't know how much a lot of you know about kind of international Arctic political mobilization, so I'll just tell you a little bit about it in case you're interested in Googling something later. Of course, there's an organization called the Arctic Council, made up of 8 Arctic states. That council is also made up of permanent participants, which there are 6 groups. Permanent participants are organizations which reflect Indigenous populations across the Arctic. They don't have the permanent participants have observer status, so if the Arctic Council passes any resolutions, permanent participants can't vote. Inuit leadership was active while I was going to school in England. Maybe you've never heard these names before, but they're household names in Nunavut. Mary Simon was the president of Inuit Tapiriitsat of Canada, the National Inuit Organization. And Mary Simon was constantly stating that any talks about Arctic sovereignty has to include community. She coined the phrase, sovereignty starts at home. And that's something that Inuit have actively rallied around. Maybe some of you have heard of Shilawat Cloutier. She was Inuit Circumpolar Conference president for many years. And she did a beautiful job at raising awareness across the globe about how global realities affect the North. In 2009, the Inuit Circumpolar Conference published a circumpolar Inuit declaration on sovereignty in the Arctic, stating above all else that Inuit are of the Arctic, and if you want to talk about the Arctic, you have to include Inuit. So I give you this little really brief overview just to let you know that Inuit were active in Arctic governance debates. Thank goodness, because there was a lot of debates going on. There was lots of talk about resource development, climate change, research, federal funding, etc. So it was a really, my first couple of years in school, debates on Arctic governance were really active. really dynamic. So I learned a lot. And I don't even know if I've mentioned yet what my research question was, but when I went over to England, I wanted to go learn about what Arctic governance debates could teach me about Inuit governance. Specifically, what does Inuit governance mean in a post-land claims era? And maybe Arctic governance debates wouldn't provide me any kind of lesson, but maybe there'd be something. Maybe there's something that I could learn. Now I'm going to jump a little bit. In my head, I haven't figured out how to do this well in writing yet. I'm going to jump over. I'm going to leave England for a bit, and I invite you to join me as I remember my time during my field work. It's so interesting when you're from somewhere and you go home to do field work. Is it field work? What is it? I struggled a lot with those kinds of questions. I'm going home, so I guess it's homework. So, thank you. I'll keep that one in. So for my field work, I went back to Nunavut. Now, I've mentioned that I'm from Baffin Island, and sorry I don't have a map there. Baffin Island is the island right beside Greenland. It's the most easterly part of Nunavut. For my field work, I went to the westerly part of Nunavut, the part of Nunavut that's connected to the NWT. It's called the Kitikmeot region, in case you're interested. I went to 3 communities, Cambridge Bay, Joe Haven, and Kutluktuk. I chose that region and I chose those communities because I have very little experience in the western part of Nunavut. I'm from the eastern region. I grew up also in Rankin Inlet, which is central Nunavut. So I wanted to go somewhere I had very little experience in, just as a way to kind of encourage new learning. You go somewhere new, you learn something. I'd never been to this part of Nunavut. I thought maybe I'll have something to learn. And I learned so much over there. And what was so interesting about being over there is that although Nunavut is one territory, there is a lot of inter-territory tensions, which I think is pretty common anywhere you go. There's tensions within provinces, regions, whatever, even within communities. So it was interesting to be out west because there's a strong west-east tension that often gets stated explicitly. And there's a lot of reasons for that tension. I mean, geographically, they're really far apart. In terms of language, the language, although Nunavut is made up of Inuit, there are many different dialects of Inuktitut. And the language that is spoken in the west is quite different from the east. Interestingly enough, language loss is stronger in the west, and language retention is stronger in the east. So that adds to a tension that occurs in Nunavut. The land is quite different. But what's so interesting that being out in the west, I was amazed at how access to the land, there was so much more access to the land in the west than the east. And it was so amazing to kind of see how that access translated to a different vibe in the community. When I was out west, I was amazed at how much food sharing was actively practiced. I ate so well when I was in the west. Country food, you know, fish, caribou, whale, everything. Lots of good food. So I went to these 2 communities after my time in England, and I was kind of desperate. I was like, oh my goodness, I need to get out of the English way of thinking about the Arctic. Maybe I'll learn something new and exciting when I'm in Nunavut. And following the lines of how Inuit were mobilizing around Arctic governance debates, when I was in the Kitikmeot, when I asked people, what does Inuit governance mean to you? They talked in terms of wellness and well-being. And I'm just going to share with you 2 different definitions of wellness and well-being that I came into contact with. This first idea of Inuit governance of wellness was expressed by communities who had wellness centers. When I asked them, okay, if Inuit governance means wellness to you, what does wellness mean to you? And people talked candidly about what wellness meant to them in the settlement today. They talked about things like food banks. They talked about things like AA meetings. They talked about things like breakfast programs for kids. They talked about education and training in emotional, healthy expression, but also other skill development. They talked about laundry facilities. They talked about support in filling out forms for various government programs. They talked about having a space where people could use the phone or where they can go and get some coffee to talk to someone. But they also talked about wellness as being a place that supported land programs, on the land programs for kids. So this was one idea of wellness that was talked about in the community. There was the second kind of wellness that was talked about, wellness as well-being. And it was talking about wellness as well-being that really rich philosophical debates emerged in the most straightforward, everyday kind of talk that you have in the community. When people talked about well-being, they usually talked about the youth and how the youth were doing, the status of the youth in the community. They didn't just talk about youth, but youth were often who they talked about. People, when talking about well-being, talked about how life today in the settlement, people are stuck. They are lost. They are in a fog. It is like they're going stir crazy. They would talk about things like suicide, abuse, drinking, people spending all their time playing video games and gambling. And while they use these very straightforward terms to explain what they mean, because what they were trying to do is they were trying to express what's not well-being. What are people doing that's not supporting their well-being? And as we talked about these things formally, but more often informally in conversations, what people were articulating was the general presence of a greater apathy in life, about inactivity in family life, about the reality that a lot of young people in communities in Nunavut were not contributing to the social and financial well-being of the family. Missing was this idea of being supportive, of being responsible. And people also talked about the challenge when family members are not active, or when community members are not active with each other. And as people talked about these things, because they're talking about societal breakdown, they're talking about intergenerational tensions and violence. That we know this. I mean, communities know this already. But what was so interesting is that as people talked about these challenges, what was always being talked about was the land and the opportunity for the land to provide a little bit more support in the community. When talking about well-being, what is well-being? When asked, can you describe what you mean by well-being? Or why is the land connected to well-being? People would say that when you need peace, you should go out on the land. When you need silence, you should go out on the land. When you need to find renewal, you should go out on the land. They also said, when you're out on the land, there's a consistency of behavior that people can draw on. And that behavior brings people together. Again, people know this. I knew this. I mean, I always guessed it, but it was nice to actually just sit down with people and have these kinds of conversations. So now what? You know, I had these experiences back home. I had these amazing conversations that reaffirmed what I kind of sensed what governance meant to Inuit. So what? So what do I do with this? Because I knew what I was hearing from people was true. I got it. Like, I really understood what they were saying. But the truth is, I didn't know what to do with it quite yet. As my research, I already stated, was on governance, I wondered what I should do with all these things that people were talking about. I struggled a lot. I don't think I've mentioned this yet. I struggled a lot when it was time for me to do my field work in Nunavut. And we don't have the time, nor do I have the emotional capacity to get into the nitty-gritty details of why I struggled so much going home to do my field work. But there's a lot of tension there, a lot of emotion that kind of followed me as I was traveling back to Nunavut from England. But I will tell you this, even though it might sound a little bit cheesy, I was lost myself after my time in Nunavut, after being in England. I didn't know what to do, and I think I didn't know what to do because I was stuck in this binary thinking, this us versus them mentality. England as colonizer, Nunavut as colonized. I spent a fair amount of time in this space, within this binary. And while I've been active in my participation in this binary, it never has served me well in the end. If I'm really honest with you, it's never actually worked out. And I think part of my challenge in being in Nunavut and studying in England was I was coming face to face with this challenge idea. Do I just accept that what I'm experiencing is another example of us versus them, colonized versus colonizer? And that's probably when I would have most logically quit school. After all this time and all this emotion and all this funding and traveling, I could have quit then. I really, really could have quit then. But I figured, well, quitting's not really an option, so what do I do? What the hell do I do? And I struggled with it for a really long time. I didn't know what to do. And again, I'm not quite sure how I came to this new conclusion, but I came to a new conclusion. I realized instead of moving naturally between the extremes of us versus them, I'm going to have to start a new relationship with binary thinking. I needed to find some kind of relationality between us and them. And if I was to do that, I honestly had to ask myself, what are the relating factors? What kind of relating factors could I find between international nation-state interest of the Arctic? How do I connect that with what Inuit are saying back home? How do I make these two factors relate somehow? How do I what's the relationship beyond them being the colonizer? And I have to admit, the reason I had to think about this was for my sheer survival. I was in England. I was going to school in England. I was in the belly of the beast, if you'd like to say. And I don't deny that. I was fully engaged. I went there. I paid the fees. I signed right up. But being there, having access to the education that I did have access to, I had to make a choice. Am I going to stay here and be angry, or am I going to do something different? Am I going to try something different? And I had to make a choice, so I had to say, okay, let me see if I can make this work somehow. And that's what I did. I started to move beyond my binary thinking and said, okay, let's find the relationship between us and them. Because in a lot of ways, me wondering about that relationship, I was asking myself, how do I relate England to Nunavut in a new way? What's the new relationship between Nunavut and England that goes beyond England as the colonizer? I mean, I never forgot that. Don't worry, I never forgot that. But I didn't want that to be the only narrative in which I existed within. So I had to ask myself, okay, what's next? What in the world do I do now? And boy, was I surprised at the kind of support I found when I opened myself up to finding relationality between England and Nunavut. And this is where it gets a little bit theoretical. And I do apologize. I've tried to make this theory that I'm going to share with you as cool as possible, but there's only so much you can do, right? So, I mean, if it helps, the pictures are still up, so please don't feel alone. So what did I find? Well, interestingly enough, I found theory. I found theoretical debates on space. And I know that sounds so nerdy, but it's true. How the discipline of geography, specifically how space was being talked about in England, was the greatest new learning I could possibly do. That, and I traveled to Kentucky through reading of bell hooks. Two people. I did not expect that these two things would be the thing that got me out of the rut, but it did. Space and Kentucky. So I'm just going to spend some time right now talking about it because I have a lot of passion about it. And I think in terms of theory, there's a lot of rich theory that can really help explain and complicate how governance is talked about in Nunavut and how it implicates Inuit. And actually, I would argue, how it would inform Indigenous nations right across Turtle Island. I think there's something here, maybe. So I'm going to talk about space for a little bit. Again, sorry guys. And I've titled this section, A Call for Space in England. While there are many scholars, many geographers who explore space, my research and I have learnt most from a person named Doreen Massey. Massey is a world-renowned British geographer, and she has explored space through various lenses in Britain, notably labor, regionalism, and gender. While her work is extensive, for the purpose of this presentation, I draw heavily from her book, For Space, and Space, Place, and Gender. And these books have provided me with fantastic engagement. These books, and I would argue Massey's career, are rallying cries to reclaim space, to reconceptualize, to repoliticize, and to reimagine space. It has taken me the full length of my degree, so 5 years plus, to understand how Massey talks about space. I picked up these books, and you know when you find a book and you're like, yes, I know it's this, and then you read like the first paragraph and you're like, I have no idea what this says. So yes, I may be going to a fancy university, but boy, did I have to work hard. So it's taken me a really long time to understand how Massey talks about space. Sorry, I just lost my flow here. And while at first her words seem so different from mine, because Massey uses a language that I really had to work hard to learn, upon reflecting on my consistent engagement with her work, I appreciate how the sum of her work speaks to the metaphysical. And actually, I would argue her words have helped me broaden my understanding of the metaphysical. Now, I had a fantastic paragraph about the metaphysical that I can't find, so I'll just wing it. I mean, metaphysical, if I was to talk about space, the most practical definition I would offer this room is that space is metaphysical understanding. And when I say metaphysical, what I mean is that metaphysical relates to the total sum of relationships that exist on this earth and spread beyond this earth to include the universal. Think of Vine DeLorean, how he talks about metaphysical, if you want a better reference point. Metaphysical is that understanding that relationality shapes our entire reality, and that relationality stems from individual people right out into the universe. And there's a lot of complicated relationships, and not everything's straightforward and clean or easy, but relationality is key. That's what space means. So when you hear fancy British people talking about space, it's their way of talking about metaphysical understanding. And like I said earlier, it was so interesting to see how British debates on space could really inform me, really educate me. And the reason is because Doreen Massey has done a beautiful job in highlighting not only what space is, but what space is not. And I'll share some of her work with you because I'm just so happy that I figured it out. So when Doreen Massey talks about space, she talks about space as not a closed system. Space is not closed. I understand closed systems through the work of Vern Redekop, whose book, From Violence to Blessing, has been really important in my learning about space. My understanding of closed systems come from him and my very good friend Tamalik, who introduced me and supported me through my reading of Vern's book. Closed systems occur when relational systems are made up of fixed players. Closed systems essentially mean when the same people interact all the time. And in fact, they interact all the time. They interact so regularly that it's almost impossible to include new players in that interaction. One of the pitfalls or one of the dangers of closed systems is that it can fall into a pattern that is very hard to change. It's really hard to change the nature of the relationship of a closed system. So that's one example of what space is not. Massey talks about how space is not representation. Representation is an exercise of conceptualization. So this idea, space is not just an idea of something. Massey also argues that space cannot be understood as occurring on the surface only. Massey would argue that space does not lack depth. And Massey uses the example of maps to kind of explain what space is not. And just think of a map. And there's a lot of excellent debate about within Indigenous scholarship that points to the limit of maps. Maps don't show you everything. Maps show you surfaces, maps shows you boundaries. There's not a lot of depth in maps. So what Massey is arguing is that if you think about maps, that's not space. That's an idea of space. And you already know what are the political implications of imagining space in that way. The thing about maps is that it's just essentially a picture of territory, and it has no depth and no complication. Massey is really strong in arguing that space cannot be fixed, though there are a lot of ways to try to fix space. And when I say fix space, what I mean is trying to make space not dynamic, make it flat. One way that space can be fixed is by defining it in terms of chronology. Imagining space as having a fixed timeline. The danger of having a fixed timeline is that it establishes expectation and forces action to follow a certain timeline or predetermined stages. That's not space either. I guess one of the more fun things about space is that space is always in the process of becoming. It is never finished, nor is space completely figured out. There's a lot of loose ends in space. In short, space is made up of multiple stories and multiple possible outcomes and multiple uncertainties. And again, if you just think of space as the metaphysical, that makes sense. If you have kind of a metaphysical appreciation of how the reality of our universe, not everything's clean, not everything's tidy, not everything's straightforward, not everything ends or begins the same way. There's a lot of change, a lot of possibility, and a lot of uncertainty. For me, why space is so fascinating and relevant is when you start making the connection between space and politics. Politics are an expression of space. How one understands politics says a lot about how one sees space. And how one sees space is reflected in the types of politics it creates. And I would argue that Indigenous nations appreciate the intimate relationship between politics and space. Indigenous nations carry embodied knowledge of this fact, because colonization is the experience of fixing space. And in drawing on Massey's argument of what space is not, one can see how colonization is fixing space. Indigenous communities often exist within a closed system. As Redekop himself points out, Indigenous nations and nation states interact within a fixed pattern, within a closed system. And while other players may be included, Indigenous nations and nation states are always the core of any kind of interaction in terms of politics. Contemporary Indigenous experience and nations are defined by representation. We know this. The realities of Indigenous nations exists on conceptualization. There are ideas of what being Native means. We know this. Communities know this. They know this intimately. And that's something that people are always having to come up against, having to fight against. Idle no more, right? Having that loud voice speaking back to the rest of the country saying, how you think about us is not right. We are way more than you have ever realized. Having to speak out against that is because the conceptualization of Indigenous nations are so strong in Canada. It's so strong. And down south, up north, same thing. It's a strength that's, I don't even know how to finish that sentence. It's crazy how strong it is. I guess that's the best way I can say it. It's crazy how strong the power of representation is. And across scales, Indigenous nations, communities, families, and individuals struggle with the constant presence of a single dimension narrative. Their single dimension. That single narrative, it's not complicated, it's pretty straightforward. Canada came here, this is Canada. I guess if you're looking for a single narrative. And while parts of this narrative may change, the truth is that single narrative never really goes away. And that's a struggle that people come up across. This is what people are engaging with. Oh, sorry, how am I doing for time? 15? Okay, good, I can do that. And also, Indigenous nations are seen as having a single chronology for development. I guess that's the most straightforward understanding. There's a certain idea, there's a certain strategy for how development should occur. That's a fixed chronology. That's the process of fixing space. You should follow these stages in this order, and then you'll be developed. So in short, colonization has tamed the metaphysical, to say the least. It has taken the spirit out of how relationality is understood, not only in practice, but in scope. It has taken the space away from individuals, families, communities, and nations. Individual and collective awareness of the metaphysical at all scales of Indigenous being have been broken down. That awareness, that metaphysical awareness, has been lessened. And one of the more challenging factors is that what has resulted is a collective and individual forgetting of how the metaphysical is practiced in the everyday, How do we practice our metaphysics every day in our relations with people, spaces, and places? So it helped a little. I mean, I know that last bit sounded a little bit sad. Like, it's not exactly peppy. But I was amazed at how much relief I found when I could engage with a theoretical understanding that did all the hard work for me. Although it took me a long time to really understand what this theoretical stuff about space was all about, once I did figure it out, it opened my mind up to a whole new level of thinking. For once, I could look at something and say, yes, that's exactly what's happening. Yes, this is what I'm struggling with. Yes, this is what people in Nunavut are struggling with. We're struggling with the fact that space is being taken away from us. We're struggling with the fact that we don't have enough space to move or to imagine our lives in a different way. And that was so thrilling, because finally I could say, yes, that's what I've been fighting for. This is why I struggled so much my first couple of years in England. I was constantly being engaged in conversations that took space away from me. Hooray, hooray, I'm so happy I found it. I'm so happy I found that theoretical debate. And I found it in England. It was British people having that debate about life in England. I was so surprised that what they were talking about was so relevant to my experience in Nunavut. It was so engaging, it was so exciting. The other exciting part, the other source that has helped me so much in finding a relationship between England and Nunavut that was different, was the work of bell hooks. I don't have enough time to talk about how much bell hooks has meant to me and how much bell hooks has meant to my work. And there's so much, her work is so theoretically engaging, it's wide-ranging, and it has a lot of depth. And if I was just to share with you some of my more favorite things about bell hooks, I would share with you 4 things. Her work opened my eyes to feminist discourse. I'm a little embarrassed that it's taken me to my PhD to fully engage feminist discourse, but that's just the reality of things. But boy, did she give me an education. She grew me up, actually. Feminist discourse has been central in my re-articulation of what Inuit governance means in a highly globalized context. That's all I got to say about that. Her work, it's been central, and it's feminist discourse is so diverse, it's so engaging, and it's so strong. And it was bell hooks who taught me that. Bell hooks is, so it's not only, she's informed me about methodology, a feminist methodology. Bell hooks also helped me understand the importance of self-esteem. And I don't have, I've written way too much again, but it was bell hooks' work on self-esteem that not only kept me in school, but also helped me understand what the challenge I was experiencing and what I was talking to people in Nunavut about. We knew that people were struggling. We could talk about things like substance abuse. We could talk about things like suicide. We could talk about apathy. We could talk about inactivity. But it was by learning about self-esteem that I really could point to something and say, yes, that is what Inuit are struggling with. We're struggling with self-esteem. And although Inuit have had political mobilization, although the experience of Inuit nationalism has added a new kind of rhetoric in terms of pride of being Inuit, pride of being Indigenous. Nationalism is not self-esteem. There's huge, significant differences between the two. And for so long, up until year 2, I kind of thought they were the same thing. I thought nationalism was enough. Turns out, no, it is not enough. And actually, if I wanted to remain true to how Inuit communities were talking about governance as wellness and well-being, I had to talk about self-esteem. And in being able to talk about self-esteem, I had to point to the limits of nationalism. And not only like everyday like Canadian nationalism in terms of indigeneity nationalism. And that was the hardest thing I ever had to do. Seriously, hardest thing I ever had to do. But I did it with full intentions and love. Like I didn't not to be mad at nationalism. I did it in a search for what self-esteem really means for Inuit. So I'll just leave it at that. We can talk about it more later if you want to talk afterwards. The other 2 things that Bell Hooks taught me about, healing. She talked about healing. And Bell Hooks, as many of you may already know, is an African-American feminist and cultural critic from the States. She talks lots about the reality of Black reality in America. And one of the things her books constantly talk about is the need to heal from the trauma of being Black in America, the traumatic reality of life. And how do we heal? How do we support people to move beyond that trauma? Again, trauma can be talked about in a lot of different ways, but what I appreciate about Bell Hooks is that she was connecting the need of healing to trauma. How do we organize communities? How do we organize our governance around healing? Maybe it's because of her work as a feminist philosopher that I could find comfort and a space to actively engage these questions. The last thing that Bell Hooks gave me was the right to claim the word love when talking about governance. Bell Hooks has a beautiful array of books about the strength and possibility and the necessity of love in terms of social movements and social uplifting. Her work is fascinating. And I mean, her use of love, it's not like that airy-fairy love, yay, like that kind of patriarchal understanding of romantic love. She's talking about everyday expressions of love that provide the support necessary to get through all of life's hardships. That's the kind of love she's talking about. And the kind of love that Bell Hooks talks about is the kind of thing Inuit are talking about when they talk about wellness and well-being. That's what Inuit are talking about when they talk about Inuit governance. They're talking about the necessity of love, not only love in terms of self-love, which connects to self-esteem, but love for a community, love for place, love, that kind of love that will inspire you to do the heartbreaking work of healing from trauma. That's what Bell Hooks gave me. And it was so fantastic, so fantastic. I sense that I should be coming to an end soon. But I guess I'll just end with another caveat of another group of reading I'm doing. As I mentioned before, my research is looking at what does Inuit governance mean in a post-land claims era. I want to say, okay, well, how can I express what Inuit governance means? And interestingly enough, I've also been doing a lot of reading into addictions. As I mentioned before, Inuit communities struggle with addictions. We have serious issues with addictions and substance abuse. And it's not been fun reading, but it's been so informative. And what I really appreciate about learning about addictions, but more specifically recovery from addictions, is how ideas of, again, love and self-esteem naturally flow within these debates. But the thing about addictions and the recovery from it, they provide a space in which to talk about the importance of emotions. And maybe this is what I'll end with. If I was to suggest to you right now what my conclusion would be for my research question, if I was to suggest a conclusion to how Inuit should reorientate themselves towards governance, I would argue that for Inuit to reorientate governance, they should reorientate towards emotional development. Inuit have always understood the importance of emotions. I would argue Inuit have always known that emotions, the emotions that we experience individually and the emotions we experience collectively, those are powerful forces. Forces as powerful as the wind back home. Forces as powerful as snow, winter weather. The expression of emotions, they can essentially make or break a community. They can make or break a person. And what's so interesting about Inuit experience on the land is that there's constant affirmation about the importance of emotional development. If you're interested in learning about Inuit emotional development, there's a fantastic author by the name of Jean Briggs. She's an anthropologist. She has this fantastic book called Never in Anger. And it's a wonderful book that highlights or provides an overview or even an introduction of Inuit socialization of children. Essentially how Inuit helped kids learn emotional development. That has been broken when everything else got broken. When our metaphysical understandings got broken, our awareness and our reverence for the emotions that we feel also got challenged. And what I would argue is that if Inuit are facing this new kind of onslaught of international interest, if this new wave of international interest is coming our way, and if this new wave continues to fix space like colonization has fixed space, then Inuit can look within the community and understand our emotional expression and development. I think if we do that, then we will uncover new spaces that we so desperately need. I think that would be my conclusion. It's a little rough. Like I said, I'm still writing, so if you have any suggestions on how to say that better, I would really appreciate it. And I'll include you in my acknowledgements. Why don't I leave it at that? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Thank you. So I don't know how this happens.
We have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has anything to add or contribute.
Oh? No? Yes,
First, I'd like to just thank you for presenting your work.
thank you.
So, thank you for that. And you had mentioned kind of Binder Lauria's work on metaphysics earlier. And when you spoke about Inuit governance and emotional development
Yep.
at the end, it also made me reflect on some of his work that I think is saying very similar things to you, but through a different language, which is his notions of tribal sovereignty rooted in kind of personal maturity, or like the personal growth, cultural maturity and integrity of tribal communities. So looking to some of that might, I think, also be useful, because I think you're both saying very similar things. Right? Different contexts, because he's talking about tribal nations in the United States and particularly the Lakota. But for him
Nice, thank you. That'll be really good to look at. And actually, as you were speaking, one of the things I think I failed to state explicitly is kind of along the lines of what you were sharing. One of the things that has really helped me conceptually is to kind of understand the difference and the relationality between external forces and internal forces. So there's that constant play of internal and external that can be expressed through maturity, can be kind of expressed through how one reacts to things, what one chooses to react to. So I think those concepts kind of tie into what you're saying, at least for me personally. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. Just really wanted to first say thank you as well for your talk today. It really opened up my mind, and it really helped me in terms of some of the thoughts that I've been having and some of the work that I want to do. And your discussion on space and its being fixed and closed was very informative in terms of ideas that I have around it. Looking at other people's ideas around creating space at the United Nations level for Indigenous peoples to have full participation, but to have a better understanding of what that space is and what you're up against.
Yeah.
More than anything else was you've really articulated it very clear and very well, and I just really want to say thank you more than anything else.
Awesome, thank you. That's cool. Space is one of those terms that gets thrown out a lot. And I mean, I used it all the time. You know, when you just kind of throw it out in a sentence, you're like, ooh, blah, 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 space. And it wasn't until this degree that I started to take responsibility for the words I used and how I used them. And that's a good question. If what we're looking for is space in which we can move in, what kind of spaces are we looking for? Again, it's almost one of those kind of, it almost seems silly to ask that question because it seems so basic, but it's actually, no, when you get into it, it's a really complex question. And you have to really be clear on why, in answering questions like, why do I need space? Why am I seeking space? Why is this space not available to me? So asking questions about spaces and the kind of spaces we have is always, I would argue, a shrewd academic strategy. Check out Massey, she's awesome. Yeah. Hi.
Jackie, thank you for your presentation. And as a third-year PhD student, I really want to encourage you to know that you can
Yes.
make it to the end.
Yes.
And that you have to, because that's life for us students who are coming up behind you as well. And
Nice.
really wish you well, and I find your work very exciting.
Cool.
And thinking in terms of, you're talking about the impact or the importance of emotions for Inuk people, and I think it's been critical for Indigenous peoples always. I don't know if you're familiar with Lee Brown's work on effective competency. He essentially looked at, he did a dissertation at UBC and was on effective competency, essentially how to help our children to regain their effective competency, their ability to regulate emotions, to recognize emotions, because that was one of the first things that the oppressors removed from our children in residential schools. And now he says that that's reverberated through our communities, and he says it happens everywhere from the family to relationships up to governments and community organizations. So that might be of interest to you.
That's awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, Lee Brown, 2004. And I was thinking about you were talking about space and emotion, and how what's happened is colonization has effectively fixed space. It's made it static. Whereas we think of it as this two-dimensional or even three-dimensional, but we know there's so much more beyond it in terms of space. But I guess we could consider that that's also what's happening to our emotions as well. Our emotions have become fixed. We've gotten stuck in certain ways of thinking and reacting rather than acting. So I was just thinking about that analogy or that connection that probably exists between space and emotion.
Nice, thank you for that. I'll definitely look into that. And as you were talking and as you use that phrase, regulate emotion, that's exactly what I struggled with the most those first 2 years in England, just connecting what you're saying to my personal experience. I didn't know how to effectively express what I was feeling. I actually didn't know what I was feeling, really. And then I didn't know how to effectively express it in an environment that was so different to anything I had known. And actually, while I fought being in England and I resented the fact that I had to account for my emotional experience in England, I greatly suffered because of it. Like, honestly, I greatly suffered from it. I had to learn, and this whole 5 years has been an experience of doing exactly what you just talked to me about, having to learn how to regulate that emotion, how to deal with excess emotion, and how to be productive with it. I just had to do it in order to survive. So thank you for that. Awesome. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you
Thanks.
as well. Again, the discussion on space is something, or fixed space is something that really got me thinking. I'm currently in an Inuit film studies course. We had Alexina Kulu.
Oh,
on the
nice.
other day. She was talking about Project Surname.
Yep.
Photography, and it sort of drew me to that another analogy of how relationality was sort of narrowed and fixed by the introduction of this other naming system. So yeah, thank you for that.
Completely. Awesome, thank you. In case people don't know, Project Surname was an experience for Inuit right across the circumpolar. Inuit never had last names. Inuit had a complex naming system, but also a complex kinship system. And, you know, if you're connected to Indigenous experience, you're aware of these kind of various ways relationality can be expressed, naming being a really big part of it. When the Canadian government started to interact more regularly with Inuit, there was a problem in terms of paperwork, so they needed to introduce last names to Inuit. And the process of giving Inuit surnames has been well documented and is quite an invigorating kind of debate or case study in that nexus between Indigenous relationship with government forces. So if that's something that really interests you, I would recommend looking at Project Surname. Jeff.
Hey, Jackie, really enjoyed it, and
Nice.
I look forward to reading your final dissertation. And I like your conclusion as is. So
Nice.
no need to rework it.
Nice.
It seems like I can't believe it's been 5 years because we're just talking about kitchen consultation models
Yeah.
when you're doing your thesis, and now we've moved into. It's really great to see your discussion of space and bell hooks. So my question is, in addition to bell hooks, how have you engaged with some of the Indigenous feminist research, or how have you found that useful in deepening some of your work?
No, completely. That's an excellent question. Indigenous feminist work, I came into it while I was in England, actually. So I felt at home in that debate, and I found lots of examples right across Turtle Island to be really effective. Interestingly enough, I really engaged with feminist discourse coming out of the States, more specifically, not excluding feminist discourse in Canada. I mean, I would not be here today if it wasn't for Lee Merkel's work, of course. But works like, I'm going to mess up names here, Reina Ramirez, is that right? Her work on understanding movement of Native people in highly concentrated urban areas has really helped me critically engage with my interest in space and movement, and how living within settled areas, confined areas, areas off the land, how new patterns have to emerge and what do those patterns look like. I would also not be here today if it was not for the work of Andrea Smith, particularly her book on unlikely alliances. I believe it's the American Right and Christian Movement. I don't know the exact title, but it's her work focuses on unlikely gendered alliances, and that has proven really amazing for me, because what she's interested in is looking at coalition building or building alliances between unlikely partners. And actually, if I think about it, I came into knowledge about Idle No More really late. I'm not on Facebook, so I really didn't know what was happening. And by the time, luckily, I had two great friends, Don Smith and my friend Tamalik, who educated me about what Idle No More was. And thank goodness for their patience, because it took me a long time to get it. And what I really appreciated about Idle No More when I started looking into it was how it was also a call out for alliance building. I think that's really helpful and really fits the nature of what I was struggling myself, needing to get beyond an us versus them way of thinking. So I don't know, I think that answers most of your question. Yeah. Cool, maybe that's it. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it.